Good evening. I'm Steve Slota. I'm an assistant professor in residence at University of Connecticut in the Department of Educational Psychology in the MEAG School of Education. And I am also a faculty member in the Digital Media Design Department in the School of Fine Arts. This evening, I am bringing to you a conversation with a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Trent Hergenrader of the Rochester Institute of Technology. Trent is a creative writing professor. I've known him for, I think, almost 11 years now. We met at the Games Learning and Society Conference in Wisconsin back when he was a grad student. He is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin education system, and he has gone on to do all kinds of interesting things with world building and role playing. And if I recall correctly, when we first met, your project was called Hellwalkie, and it was a Fallout post-apocalyptic style Milwaukee role playing collaborative world building thing.
Yeah.
I'll add that since we met, we've worked on a bunch of projects together. We've written together. He's published chapters in my books, and I've worked with him on some of his iterative design for his world building deck. He's also the author of this book, Collaborative Worldbuilding for Writers and Gamers. There is a deck that goes along with it that can help you do some of your own world building. And I've invited him here today to take some questions, to talk to you about what makes world building worth doing, and sort of what are some of the pedagogical affordances of something like world building. So if you're a teacher, how could you use something like this in a classroom, or how could somebody use this to teach or learn in some other non-traditional teaching and learning environment? So with that, I'll hand the mic over to Dr. Hergenrader. And If anyone has questions, I'll keep an eye on the chat and sort of moderate. And what we're hoping is after he does his spiel, folks will have some things to ask, and we can make this more conversational as opposed to didactic. So do feel free to drop your thoughts or questions into the chat, and I'll be sure to bring them up. Take it away.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Slota. From what I understand, everyone should have read most of the book by now, or at least you're familiar with the concepts in collaborative world building for writers and gamers. And I thought what I would do is just start off with a quick presentation. I'm going to move pretty fast because hopefully you're familiar with these concepts, and if not, we can talk through them a little bit more. But basically, how the world building work that I do is deeply connected to role play games and basically finding different types of stories. So I'm going to try and share my screen here, and it looks like you can see it. You all see it?
Okay, great. You're good.
Okay, so like Steve introduced me, I'm Trent Hergenrader. I'm an associate professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology. My area of research is creative writing studies, or how we can do different things in creative writing classes rather than just try and promote sort of literary publications. So I do things with collaborative writing, networked writing, digital writing, things like that. And then also games and education. So basically, it's how to use role-playing games. What I really focus on is using role-playing games and other types of games to help writers come up with new ideas and see things from different angles. So I just want to run through this real quickly. I'm working on another book now it's tentatively titled The World Building Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play. And I'm going to get into a little bit of that a little bit later, but the idea is that the first book on world building was all about fiction and speculative worlds, and this next book is going to be about how you can use similar world building approaches to sort of understand our world a little bit more. So I thought I'd start with this definition that I'm still sort of working through, but more or less what I describe world building as an attempt to create an accurate representation of a given place at a specific moment in time that accounts for multiple unique perspectives and captures what most reasonable people would say is generally true about the world. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a fictional world or whether you're talking about our world. That's sort of the idea, is that worlds are too enormous, like our entire planet is too enormous for any one person to really capture it. So what we're really trying to do is just say, okay, well, what could we say at a given moment in time in a certain location? What is that world like? And of course, there are worlds within worlds. I've got the world of RIT's campus, and the world of Rochester, and the world of upstate New York, and the world of New York State, and the world of the Northeast part of the United States, right? So you can keep thinking about how all these different worlds sort of are nested within each other, and trying to figure out where is the most great stuff for your storytelling. And the concepts of scope, sequence, and perspective are really key, as is the method I have for talking about structures and substructures that will sort of highlight the social forces at work in a world. We talk about scope. I'm using Tolkien here as the one example. Talking about scope, it's the breadth of the world, it's sort of the physical extent of the world, and then also the depth of it. So when we think about, there's always, when you're telling a story, you're talking about setting up your world, there's always going to be something that's on the outside of that frame, right? There's always the world next door. So if you know anything about Tolkien and Middle Earth, it's actually, the planet is Arda. There are other continents. Middle Earth is one of them. We don't really get into any of that much. So the scope of this, of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, Lord of the Rings is basically from the Shire down to Mordor. The Hobbit is from the Shire over to Erebor, the Lonely Mountain. And then it's all these different places that they encounter in between that function as their own sort of separate worlds. This is what I call, too, within the scope, we've got different focal points. So the Shire is a focal point, Rivendell is a focal point, Moria is a focal point, and then Gondor and Mordor, right? And the idea is that they're all within the world of Middle Earth, but then they each function with their own sort of compact world within Middle Earth, and we can exchange sort of compare, we can make comparisons between them. And a lot of fantasy and science fiction, as I'm sure you're probably aware, is about people who are leaving their normal world, the world that they think they understand, and then they're visiting other worlds and comparing what they know about the world to what they're witnessing. So you get the hobbits from the Lord of the Rings that are encountering elves, they're encountering humans, and they're thinking about how does their worldview compare with these other species. Sequence is basically the timeline. The idea for the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings is that they're happening very near the end of the Third Age, where this great evil has reawoken. And by the time we get to the end of the end of Lord of the Rings, it is now sort of closed the Third Age, and is now moved into the Fourth Age, which we don't know a ton about. There's some of the stuff in the appendix. But the idea with a lot of worlds is that a lot of worlds and world building projects is that the world is either just had a huge change, or it's on the verge of a huge change. And it's a really useful place to start when you're thinking about storytelling, because you're always going to have characters that want to see that change happen, speed it up, or they're going to want to keep that change from happening, preventing it from happening, right? So sometimes that could be a revolution, that could be, a colonial force coming in and trying to take over some area, right? So it's often in world building projects, it's a nice thing to do, to think about, well, how can the world be changing in some way, either having just changed, how are people reacting to that change, or it's about ready to change. You think about a post-apocalyptic story, for example, world's undergone a massive change. How now are people dealing with that? The last one, which can be a little bit tricky, is perspective, and that's whose version of the world are we getting? For example, in Star Wars, there's never really a clear, perspective in terms of who's telling the story, but we know that the Empire is bad, right? And we know that the Jedi are good. So there is some perspective there that has although I guess Disney is now sort of playing with that in interesting ways. But one of the things too that people I think often overlook in Lord of the Rings is that it actually is supposed to have been written by Frodo and Bilbo. When we open up in the film, they give a nice nod to this as Bilbo is writing concerning hobbits and explaining the Shire. And this is actually how the book Lord of the Rings opens up. So it's basically Bilbo and Frodo have written Lord of the Rings. So it's less about an objective account, and it's actually what these two authors are writing about in a third person perspective, where they don't use I, they put themselves as characters. And Tolkien very cleverly uses this. If you read his letters, he says this is where some of the inaccuracies or some of the things that don't quite add up, he just gets to blame Bilbo for not understanding those parts of the story, which I think is kind of fun. Then I've got these four major structures of governance, economics, social relations, and levels of equality amongst different social groups, and cultural influences. And the idea here is that there are 14 substructures within these, but this system can be used to model real world locations. You could do ancient Greece or ancient Rome or ancient Egypt or whatever, antebellum United States, or you could do Mad Max Fury Road or Lord of the Rings or whatever you want. So the idea is that these are things that these 14 categories are basically true for all worlds, historical or fictional. And the 14 categories within them that hopefully you've seen from the readings, we've got governance, government presence, or how present the government is in daily life, rule of law, which covers things like policing and the justice system, Social services, which would include things like public education, public health care, transportation. Economics is economic strength, which is how much wealth is available in the world. Wealth distribution is how equally it's distributed across the entire population. And then agriculture and trade gets into sort of where the wealth stems from within this society. We've got social equality between race, class, gender, and sexual identity or sexual orientation. And then finally, we've got different cultural influences, which are the military, religion, technology, and arts and culture. And again, when I do things with fantasy worlds or science fiction worlds, we might throw in here non-humans like AI or cyborgs, or if you're doing a fantasy world, elves and orcs, things like that. I've got other ones too for cultural influences that we can throw in, like drugs and drug culture or attitudes towards the natural world. Another one for governance is foreign relations. That can always be an interesting one. What is the world next door, and what are the relations with that? And I ask students when we're putting this together to rank these 14 categories on a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 means this quality is either weak or very limited or rare or sometimes even oppressed. So like if a religion was 1, for example, then maybe religious influence is actually forced out of this world in certain ways. And then on the other end, 5 is strong, ubiquitous, it is promoted, it is something that if you were walking through this world, you couldn't help but notice it. So if military were a 5, for example, you would notice that there would be guard posts and training locations all over the place. And then we also try to identify which ones are changing, which aspects of the world are changing. And I put this into the card deck, where every card gets 1 number from 1 to 5, and either you can, sometimes in our classes, we'll just deal them all out randomly. Sometimes students will choose, like, I just don't want to have a world with bad gender relations, so we're just going to fix that at a 5, which means they're really, really good. And then also the trending cards about what's changing and why. And looking at these different cards and the way that the system is set up, there's always a couple 1s, a couple 5s, right? This is why I don't use rolling dice, and I have people use cards instead, because then we can control. You can't get 15, or you can't get 11 5s in a row or whatever, where you could randomly get that when you're rolling. But the point of all of this too is when students start talking through, like in their groups of 4 or 5, they need to talk about, okay, well, what does government, or what does economic strength at a 2 mean? Like, what are the things that they're seeing in the world, or how do they use that term economic strength? What does a 2 mean, right? Or class relations is a 3. Well, I push them to think about, well, what does a 3 look like in this world? What would a 4 look like? What would a 2 look like, right? What would be the different things that would put you, give you some concrete answers to how you're using both the definitions of these cards and of the categories, and then also the numbers. And the real sort of bait and switch here is that it's really easy for them to do, but then when they need to start pinning down what they're noticing, it becomes a little bit trickier to say, okay, well, what's a 3 or a 4? Someone says, well, I thought the same thing, but I had it as a 3 and you had it as a 2, right? So it doesn't really mean anything. These aren't objective, rules or anything like that. They are really meant to get people talking through, using language to describe the way that the world works, and then sort of meeting halfway in terms of how they're going to create a consensus around this. The final step is creating a wiki catalog of people, places, and things, and this is very much built on role-playing game catalogs or source books. If you're familiar with them, we've got an example of an entry. There's some sort of objective information that would be the creature, in this case, is strength and dexterity and constitution, right? This is all numeric stuff that plugs right into the dice system. But then there's also narrative that goes along with it. And the narrative describes the way that this creature behaves, how it would react in certain circumstances, what are its habits, things like that. And between these two things, the objective and the subjective sort of story, the quantitative and the qualitative, it gives you a really good sense of how you can drop anything into one of your role-playing games, or in my case, in a story, right off the bat, just by knowing that little bit of quantitative and qualitative information about it. So again, to come back to this definition and jumping into a real world example, world building is our attempt to create this accurate representation of a given place at a specific moment in time that accounts for multiple unique perspectives and captures what most reasonable people would say is generally true about the world. So this is just a stock photo that I grabbed of some soldiers in Iraq talking with a group of local people, right? So we can start applying the world building process here, my methodology. So we've got the scope, right? This is outside Baghdad. The United States is outside this scope. So we wouldn't, the story probably wouldn't be taking place within the United States, but it would be relevant that two of the people in this picture are from the United States that have a very different culture. But, you'd think that this story would probably be within, if we were to write the story of this image, it would take place in and around Baghdad. In terms of the sequence, if you didn't catch it, it was May in 2007 is when this picture was taken. And we would know that, the war had started in 2003. There had been several things going on. We can see on March 27th that there had been a bombing with a retaliation, right? So all of these things about the sequence of how long ago these things had happened would play into the ways that the people would be interacting and what would be fresh in their minds. Also with sequence, I like to point out, what would the children have lived through? What would the older woman have lived through? What would the young man have lived through? And we bring all of those life experiences to that moment when we're sort of talking about the storytelling moment in the world. And then finally, we get the perspective. So we've got different genders, different races, different classes. We don't know about sexual orientation, perhaps. We can make some guesses about class. We can make some guesses about how people feel about the government. But when we start looking through all the different perspectives, what are the most interesting perspectives here? How would everybody in this picture perhaps view this scene from a different perspective, right? Have a different idea about what the story is going to be told. And this is one of the things that I'm always telling my students is that the goal for world building is not to create a story with a protagonist that you want to tell. It's to create a world that can hold as many stories as possible. And this is really where we get this idea of a story world, which is actually an old idea, but it's really, really relevant now with transmedia storytelling and the idea that we're telling stories that are happening with the same setting across TV and film and books and comics and games and all of those things. With these massive media franchises, what's happening is the world is the thing that connects all of these stories. Rather than having it be one story, we can get Luke Skywalker, yes, but we also get The Mandalorian, and we also get Obi-Wan Kenobi, and we also get Rogue One, right? You get all these different stories that are possible, but they're all unified by the world is what holds them together. Now, the final thing here that I want to sort of transition through is this idea of environmental storytelling and emergent narrative. And environmental storytelling and emergent narrative are concepts from games, and they happen in different kind of games, but again, sort of the massive role-playing games that I like, the Elder Scrolls, the Fallout, I think are really exceptional examples of this, in which the environment is just saturated with story-making potential, right? So everything in Fallout has this very post-apocalyptic vibe. It's got the 1950s sort of feel to it, right? You can explore across the map, come across things. So the environment is giving you lots and lots and lots of story-making material. And the idea with the emergent narrative is that if all of us play this game, we're going to take different routes, we're going to meet different characters, we're going to make different choices. And all of these things allow different types of stories to emerge based on the decisions that we make, the order that we go in. So this is where what we're seeing, I think, in today's sort of media environment is that these enormous worlds, right, that hold lots and lots of different stories, there's more and more happening now in which the creators of these stories are expecting the audience to have some knowledge about the story world in order to you bring with you that knowledge. And I think when transmedia storytelling is working really, really well, then hey, maybe you're going to go check out that comic book, or you're going to watch the TV show that's supporting the movie, or however you want to think about this. And finally, as we transition now back to sort of talking about what you want to talk about, I think this is also a space in which it doubles back onto things like role-playing games, into LARP, into cosplay. How do we use our understanding and our identities to insert ourselves back into these fictional worlds to be able to maybe claim a little space for that for us in these sort of mega media franchises? So I think that's the last slide. So I'll stop sharing now. That didn't appear to stop sharing though. Is it stop sharing?
Yeah, you're all set.
Great.
Thank you. That was very, very incisive, insightful. My first question, I think, is how did you come to find value in doing this sort of thing? Like, my context for knowing you is that you were still doing research on this. It was still quite early in the scheme of games being used, or the role-playing being used, at least in this kind of format, in any educational space, never mind higher education. So how did you start thinking about this, and what was it that you've gravitated toward over the last 10 years or so?
Yeah, so I think it's been a pretty consistent trajectory with this. But what got me started was I was teaching, sort of intro to college writing and things like that, and couldn't wait as a grad student, couldn't wait to first teach creative writing. I thought it's going to be so much better than trying to teach essay writing, research writing, and things like that. And what I found is that I was not enamored with teaching creative writing, because what I found was a lot of students would just take very generic, cliched plots, or they wouldn't have any sort of sense of why these characters would be doing what they're doing or anything like that. So I thought, okay, well, what I wanted to do, it really started with the role playing. Is that what I want to do is, because I played role playing games. I'm a kid of the 80s, so I played all sorts of TSR role playing games growing up. And I thought, okay, well, let's get rid of the plot aspect and just double down on character. You create a character, and then your story is going to come. The plot in the story will come from the decisions that your character has to make. And I thought, okay, well, as we're doing this, instead of using like a canned world, right, that we would need to, everyone would need to buy the rule book or whatever, I sort of hacked Vampire the Masquerade's system and said, instead, let's do a world that we all know. It was Milwaukee. It would be a close post-apocalypse. It's like in 40 years in the future after a societal collapse and a plague, so maybe we're living that now. But what I was really, so then we went through this class and basically did what I sort of explained. The process hasn't changed all that much. It's just become more refined, in which I had them each create a bunch of people, places, and things. They tagged them to an actual map of Milwaukee, and then we did these role-playing campaigns where they're moving across the map. And it's one of those things that I had no idea. It's sort of like Mickey Mouse and Fantasia, having no idea, what I was doing or whatever with these powers. And it worked super, super well. And the students really got into the role-playing, which I appreciated. But I was really interested in the world building, because we didn't talk at all about the way that the world really worked. We just kind of talked about its broad features, and the assumptions that people were making. The ones that really jumped out were the assumptions about gender and gender relations. There were some assumptions being made about race and class, and whether those things would be better or worse in the post-apocalypse, right? And I thought, what I need to do is I need to have a system in which we talk these things through in a structured way. And basically over the years, it just gets more and more, it's been more and more refined in terms of the steps in the process. And what I'm doing now, that I've done more exploration with different types of role playing. So we've done, and this is all for my purposes for teaching creative writing, is I've taught a class in the Star Wars world. We've taught a class in the Game of Thrones world using those licensed role playing games. And the idea is, with the Game of Thrones one is fantastic if you're familiar with the world, because you need to create, the role playing game walks a group through creating a noble house. And your noble house is socially situated within one of the kingdoms in Westeros. You have to develop your relationships with sort of the elite family that's ruling it. And then everybody within the house also, you only have so many points that you can distribute amongst everybody. So somebody is the lord or the lady, and then you've got the servants and the soldiers and things like that. So it really makes it apparent that it is a structure, a very rigid social structure. So that's sort of been a lot of fun. But I've also done another project called Steampunk Rochester, in which we recreated a version of 1920s Rochester. I did this in collaboration with somebody, a faculty member in the fine arts and performing arts, that she was doing sort of Rochester as a text. So they did like 80% of the historical locations and characters, and 20% fictional. And then my group did the 80% fictional and 20% historical, with the steampunk sort of infused in it. And that's a lot of fun too, because I really like the idea of getting people to think more critically about the spaces that we all inhabit in a daily basis. And then like when people come from all around the country to go to a big school like UConn or RIT, right, they may not know about the local history. They may not know what parts of town are like what, right? So it becomes a fun sort of exercise for them to realize that they're playing, but they're doing it in a real world. And I am always, throughout the course of the semester, saying, okay, well, we're just one step outside of us role playing in our various roles. Like sometimes when I'm talking with you, I'm talking as a professor, and sometimes I'm talking as a friend, right? And sometimes I'm talking as somebody who's playing Valheim with you, right? So you go of all these different roles, and we inhabit them talk differently to my kids and my wife and my parents, right? You know what I mean? So we're always doing this automatically, and then just thinking about, well, wait a minute, what's the way that I construct the world that I'm walking through, in terms of these structures and sequence and scope and all those kind of things. Like where is the world that I live in, and how does that change from a day-to-day basis? So those are the things that, again, like trying to turn this around now for the project that I'm working on now. This book is going to be about how could people in social sciences, in different fields like engineering or environmental studies or things like that, how could you build a world and then either do simulations or role play, have the students do that work, that cognitive work, to then build that scenario. So if people are familiar with reacting to the past, there's historical sort of moments in which you get a playbook where it gives you all the characters and all the major things at the time, and then you have to sort of inhabit and role play, the way that your Roman senator would, feel about a certain issue or whatever. And I'm thinking about this as sort of like a class in which the class would write the reacting to the past. The class would be the one that would describe what are the social forces at work in the world, who are the people that are the movers and shakers, and who are the bystanders in this world, right? And getting it from that angle. So like doing it only a step forward. So that's sort of where I'm at right now, where it started and how it's gone.
You were talking about some things that I had previewed a couple of questions I wanted to talk about, and you touched on a little bit of that. But something you just said made me think of a question I hadn't even considered that I think is really important, and it has to do with reacting to the past. And this may be partly related to something else I wanted to talk about, which was sort of the set versus emergent narrative dynamic. But one thing a lot of teachers have asked me about as we've worked on games together, either through the educational technology program or in other contexts, is how do you do this world building, do this role playing in a way that is actually considerate, especially if you're dealing with moments of history that are deeply complicated. And I think about this a lot. I mean, you and I have spoken many times about like the book American Nations, or about you're listening to the great histories or the lectures that are on Audible. And I don't know. I never have a good answer for this question other than you need to talk to people who aren't like you. And I'm kind of curious, how do you think about that as somebody who does this as a scholar?
Yeah, and that's where, I always say too that the word collaborative is an important one in the book, because the idea is to get people's imaginations on collision courses. So to use one example too, where that happened at UW Milwaukee, where I did my graduate work, we were doing this post-apocalyptic sort of Wisconsin. We did a bigger, we zoomed out the scope a little bit and did Green Bay, Madison, and Milwaukee rather than just Milwaukee. And one of the students said, "Oh, well, there's a lot of Native Americans up by Green Bay, and they're going to be totally into nature and totally equipped to, get back into the whatever." And then, it's like, so as an instructor, I just kind of wait there, and there's a little clock in my head, it's like, I'm going to say something in 3, 2, and then another student raised her hand and said, I think that's really sort of an essentialist statement, that you just think that Native, and it's like, okay, great. So let's talk that through. Let's kind of debate those things. But that's where too, I've said to people that if you were, a white nationalist, there's nothing saying that you couldn't make a utopian, super racist world with this system, right? The system itself does not force you to make an egalitarian or a wonderful world or something like that. So, it's one of those things that I think that's where, having a diverse group is the best case scenario. And I know for a lot of gamers too, a lot of role-playing gamers, it still can be very sort of white male, sort of spaces. Ideally, that's breaking down. Hopefully, that's breaking down faster. But yeah, it's one of those things that I think that we see that in these worlds where we get these sort of gross essentialist ideas, it's because there were not enough designers at the table who came from diverse backgrounds. And obviously, we're seeing that a lot with sexual identity right now as well, right? So many people are saying, hey, look, we need to have as many diverse voices at the table, so then you can have worlds. And this is where it always comes back to, for what I'm trying to teach my fiction writing students, is that the world is really diverse. Our world is really diverse. Our world is really complex. And as time goes on, it only gets more complex, right? So what you want to be able to do is not build a very ham-handed world, but you want to build one in which that diversity feels natural and it feels organic. Like of course that's the way the world is, right? Rather than feeling a little bit too neat or too pat. And that's what I always tell them too. Like when they're in a world and suddenly we go to a sort of monolithic view, right, in which, oh, all the people of this religion believe this. I said, okay, well, wait a minute. In our world, not all the people of any one religion believe anything, right? I mean, they're all still very socially situated, and yeah, they may share some beliefs, but even within any major religion, there's going to be a diversity of perspectives about how they apply their faith and what it means and all those kind of things. And I think it's just sort of an easy sort of laziness. And I think this is where too, like, you can get away with it. Like, there are no nice xenomorphs in Aliens, right? Like, they're just awful bloodthirsty things that are trying to eat everybody's face, and that's like, okay, well, that's cool because we're not really trying to, like, say all xenomorphs matter or anything like that. But when we get to other things, like, I think this is one of the things that Tolkien was way ahead of his time, is that not, like, we got humans, elves, and dwarves, but not all the humans like each other, not all the elves like each other, right? They've got different political sort of opinions and points of tension in the world between them. And then, of course, there's the interspecies sort of conflicts as well. So that's where, what I'm always doing too, it's one of the things that I feel more confident when I'm doing it in a classroom than if someone's doing it, like if a group is doing it sort of on their own. That's my role as the instructor, is to let people say things that later maybe they wish they hadn't, you know what I mean? And you can jump on that and say, okay, well, why did you make that assumption, right? Or is that assumption that maybe comes from the fact that you're from the suburbs, you're relatively affluent or something like that. And that's where having, the more diversity in the class is good as well. The thing I struggle with at RIT is about a 70% man to woman ratio, 30% of the students are women. And I've had classes where it's like there's at a 20, it's 19 guys and 1 girl, right? So then it's I have to work doubly hard to make sure that we are getting some sort of gender representation. I think the students are pretty good about being conscious of it, but I definitely need to highlight that. Also, if everybody in the room is white, that's another one where the school tends to skew fairly white. So it's my job as the instructor to always be trying to poke and prod and say, let's think about this a little bit deeper. And do it in a way in which, one of the things too that what I'm trying to position for students to think about is that if you think about those structures in the world, and I ask you, who would it be great if you were going to be anybody in this world? Who would it be great to be, right? And then you can also do the reverse. Who would it be bad to be? Who would have the most obstacles, right? And it's got nothing to do with privilege or not or whatever, right? It's like, it's just obvious that certain people have advantages when they're born into the world, and they're going to have more options and fewer obstacles, and other people are going to have more of them. And it's not wrong to recognize that, right? It's actually, if you're being truthful, you need to recognize that and then say, okay, well, are we going to fix it? How are we going to fix it? If we want to improve our race relations or whatever, like, how would we go about doing that? What would be the structural things in our society that we'd need to do to bring about more equality? So all of those things, for me, the fictional stuff is always great, but it's really just trying to put critical thinking into a framework, into a game-like structure in which people can play through viewing a world from a lot of different perspectives, as opposed to, like I said, when I first started teaching creative writing in the old traditional way, it was like I'd get 3 somebody brought a gun to a party stories, right? Because it's like they're all suburban kids, they've not, been out a whole lot or whatever, and that was like high drama, and I'm like, that's so boring, right? I mean, like, there's really not a whole lot that story, there's not too many directions that story can go in that are that interesting. Whereas when we create these big worlds with lots of different characters, and characters who may find themselves in places they wish they weren't, or characters who are encountering other characters that they don't feel comfortable around, that's really good storytelling fodder. That's that sort of emergence of just 20 different imaginations in the room pumping out a world together. You're gonna get weird collisions, and that's really what we always try and focus on. I always say it's always about process, not product, as well.
Yeah, actually, now that you mentioned that, I think about this a lot in terms of assessment, because one of the hardest things to do as an instructor of any kind is to assess somebody's learning. And this is true in game design too. Like, if you're a game designer, the entire purpose of your job is to figure out, how do I properly scaffold the thing I want to teach the player to do, and then get them to do it, and then assess them in a way that feels meaningful so they'll keep playing. And that's what we call the gameplay loop, right? So,
yep.
I mean, I think a lot about how, and this is one thing I kind of miss about not being face to face right now, is that I can't listen to the externalization of people's thinking. And that's the thing every instructor really wants. When you're giving a multiple choice test is not really that people memorized stuff and then are successfully able to regurgitate it. What you really care about is, does this person understand how to properly read a problem and then be able to react to it in ways that are creative or meaningful in some particular way? And one of my colleagues who used to work at UConn, Ron Baguetto, calls these micro moments in the context of creativity, where essentially you get people to start churning out things that they think are relevant to this topic, and essentially they will afford the teacher the opportunity to intervene and say,
Yep.
hey, what do you think about this? Or what if you thought about it this way? And that's actually really crucial to apprenticing people to be better, like you said, critical thinkers, getting people to think about their own identity or think about their identity in relation to the rest of the world. Because I know for myself, world building has been a really useful exercise for getting me to evaluate different political perspectives or gender perspectives or whatever else, like anything that I need to understand about the world that I inhabit, I can look at through this lens and essentially do the whole, I mean, you wouldn't want to overgeneralize to the number system to everything, but at the same time, it's a useful lens for analyzing actual systems as they behave. And certainly it's given me a sense of how performative everything is, like you were saying earlier, that everything we do is always performance. It's just a question of which costume, which mask are you wearing at the time. And the more acutely aware somebody is of that fact, the more likely it is they're going to behave in ways that these systems will remain more coherent and that people will be sort of behaving in pro-social ways as opposed to anti-social ones.
Yeah, I think too, like with the role-playing stuff, we read a couple chapters on different identities that people will assume when they are role-playing. And some people create someone who has the exact same values as they do, and other people create someone who's completely different than they are. And I think that's another great thing, is that you're interacting with a student, from the instructor to the student, and you've got one relationship. But then when they get to create this avatar or this other sort of alter ego, right, that allows them to then have another way of interacting with the course material, right? And that's where what I do with the world building too, it's like I really have done away with a lot of the bean counting in terms of who's done what. The two major parts so basically they all have to get together. They have to write about 1,000 words for each of those 4 categories, along with a little meta-narrative lead using a Wikipedia page as sort of the guideline as to what would be 300 words, what are all the high points, just like if you open up Rochester, New York, or stores or wherever, right? There's going to be a little lead about this, and then it goes a little lower and talks about more specifics in terms of governance, economics, all that kind of stuff, for that local space. But basically, they have to write about 1,000 words for each one of those categories. So the meta narrative winds up being around 4,000 or 5,000 words, somewhere in that range. And then they need to create, usually I'm shooting for 10 people, places, or things from groups of 4 or 5. So they'll have 40 or 50 wiki entries. And they need to track that. I have them say, okay, just make sure that you're doing all that. Let me know where everything's at, because it really does need to have a critical mass of the entries as well. If it's lower than 30, there's just not enough diversity. They really need to get up into the 40s, into the 50s. But then the two main parts that factor into their grade is not whether the world is good. It is a peer evaluation to see how agreeable were people to how we get, not only just agreeing with people's ideas, but like giving their own ideas, keeping up with the work, all those kind of things. That's the first big half. The second big half is the critical reflection. If you were to do this over, like, what did you think about when you came in? How did it go? What were the things that you would do over? What are the things that you would, make sure not to do next time? What are the things that you got stuck on? What did you find most interesting? And I always find that they're really, really able to articulate well in their own language what they got out of it. And it's fun. It's always my favorite part of the semester, is reading through those. I usually, in a 15-week semester, we normally have like a week of warm up, and then they spend about 6 or 7 weeks, probably about 6 when, breaks and things like that, on 2 different worlds. I've done it before where they did 3, and I think 3 is a little too rushed. So now I just do 1, whatever kind of fantasy you want, and then 1, whatever kind of science fiction world that you want. And it's good. I mean, it was a surprise too, because this one, this semester, is an asynchronous, or it's actually a synchronous online class in which we don't meet very often. I meet with each group for about 20 minutes, half hour a week. But then because it's synchronous, it blocks out the class time for them to meet on Zoom. And this is the best result that I've ever had from a class in terms of people getting their work in and things like that. So I do feel like it's getting a little bit more refined. Like I was telling somebody the other day too, that the biggest problem tends to be the people who are really quiet and they don't want to speak their part or get their ideas in, and then the people who get super excited and won't shut up and talk over everybody, right? And those are the ones in which, one of the things too, I talk about sort of the missing chapters in my book. One of the missing chapters is demographics. Like, how are you going to account for 100% of the people in your world, right? And what percentage are, at this level of income, what people, what percentage are this religion or that religion, right? Everything needs to add up for 100%. And then the other one is everyone assuming a specific role. So you've got like a timekeeper, you've got someone whose job it is to make sure that everybody gets some, everyone gets to get some input in, you get somebody else who reminds everyone of the due dates and things like that. And I think that distribution, a student recommended that, one of my game design students had recommended that, as he was a project manager on his game design project. And I thought that's a great idea. And that also seems to work really well, just to sort of say, it's not that anybody is the project lead, but everybody has different roles to make sure that we're double checking. Because it can happen too, in which two people really start to jive on an idea, and then the other three are sort of like twiddling their thumbs over in the corner, right? So just always trying to get as many people in. And it's like a role-playing game. You can't be a participant, right? Or you can't be a bystander. You have to be a participant. You have to be involved.
Yeah, and I want to remind everybody else too, if you have questions or thoughts or anything, you can be dropping them in the chat, and I'm happy to incorporate them into the conversation. I know for myself, one of the reasons I enjoy doing this, this is the first time I've done it as a role-playing experience and in one session, and then a world-building experience in the other. I like doing it either way because I think there are different affordances of taking either path. One of them is very much about character development. How do you think about a person's thinking who you aren't, right? How do you get them into situations where they are telling an interesting story, or that things are happening and it's not just nothing? Although that gets me thinking a lot about something like Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul, where it's sort of deliberately designed to have these long moments of nothing, but done for artistic effect, and somehow that works. And I find myself going back to those examples a lot, just because I don't know why it took so long for television to get to the point where people applied common film aesthetic and technique to television, but something about whatever their team did works in a way that is deeply satisfying, in a way that other kinds of media hadn't been before. And I'm kind of curious if you think that's a consequence of the world building part, or the focus on heavy character development, or how do you read media when you go and interact with them, given all the things that you're kind of interested in?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I think we're in a sort of like a second golden age of TV. And I think that the way that a TV series like Breaking Bad, which was scripted, for the number of episodes and the number of seasons, that gives the artist that's writing it a great amount of creative control, as opposed to something like sitcoms or whatever, where it's like, they keep going until the television studio pulls the plug on them, right? So I think that there are certain things. This is one of the things too that you can tell if you're into Star Wars. The Clone Wars didn't really know where it was going or what it was doing, and the arcs in that show were much rockier than say Star Wars Rebels, where they knew they were going to have 4 seasons with the number of episodes in each one. But I think that that kind of thing that you're talking about, those pauses that allow you that a little bit of time to not be going at the breakneck speed, and whatever. I think it's an affordance of TV. It's harder to do in a film that you only have 2 hours for. I think that's one of the things. What was that? The Irishman? Is that the movie that Scorsese?
Oh yeah, they de-aged all of Pacino and whoever.
Yeah. And that one, it's like that was also, it was a 2-parter, right? And it was like they were also trying to do things with pacing in that, and I just don't think it worked as well as an hour-long episode. And then you also get one of the things that I really like with Star Wars, what they're doing with their storytelling, is just being able to map 2 genres together. So you get the Mandalorian, which is the Western, mapped onto the Star Wars story. You get Rogue One, which is the World War II military style that's mapped down. I mean, that's a movie again. But, it's one of those things that I think people too, there's so many people who didn't like Rogue One. And I think Rogue One is great. It's a World War II movie, right? Only it's Star Wars. It's like that is the genre in which it is playing with. And people too I don't think fully understand that the Mandalorian isn't just a Western. It's the Virginian. Like the Virginian was the first Western novel and one of the first Western TV shows. And it's not just drawing from the entire genre of the Western. It's really similar to the Virginian in specific. So I think that's where too, we're getting to this point where people are really media savvy. And that's where, I've heard people, same thing with WandaVision, people didn't like some of those episodes, some of those early episodes. And I feel like it's because we've lost a little bit of maybe we never had it, but they need a little bit more literacy in how media works, and that the Mandalorian in certain episodes, and definitely WandaVision, is playing with and being knowledgeable about the genre of the TV sitcom, right? For WandaVision. And you kind of have to appreciate it, right? It's like, well, I want to see superheroes, duking it out or whatever. And it's like, well, no, but that's not what they're doing, right? They're being very artful about the way that they're trying to map the sitcom, which, again, is like the sitcom's origins are trying to deal with the trauma post World War II of all the death and and it's like, and that's what that show is about processing drama through superficiality, which is why you go to the sitcom, right? So I think those are the things too in which the story world, Star Wars and Marvel, are so huge that it allows for that kind of experimentation, to be able to play around with different ideas, different genres, different styles, while still being true to sort of like the essence of the story world.
Yeah, it makes me think of, WandaVision or other media that specifically exist to comment on media. Like there is a kind of meta modernism that's emerged where now that there is this breadth of transmedia storytelling that exists, there's an opportunity for people to reflect on the consequences of the existence of this sort of enormous blob of media, right? I think all the time about how I can't consume all the media that I want. Like there are lifetimes worth of information that I could get, and so I have to kind of pick and choose. And in many ways, it's very similar to how it feels to engage with different forms of religion or different kinds of work or other forms of identity, where you're kind of having to pick and choose which pieces make the most sense for you. It's highly situated. And it makes me wonder, to the extent that something like SimCity and all these games I played in my youth, D&D, started to inform just the way I kind of frame the world for myself, and to understand the sort of chaos theory application of, taught with another story world of Jurassic Park, right? Like all of these, I was thinking in middle school about chaos theory because I read in a book about chaos theory because it was important to the characters and the plot. And that's one of those reasons I try to emphasize in the courses that I'm teaching, that media are just instructive, right? It doesn't matter whether it's intentionally entertaining. It doesn't matter whether you're teaching physics or philosophy. All of the things we do are wrapped up in how we talk about them. And all of that talk is some version of storytelling, whether it's highly fictionalized or sort of highly realistic or fidelitous to reality, which kind of gets to the question that was in the chat, actually, which is, how do your students gravitate when they're thinking about worlds? Do they move closer to fictional worlds? Do they try to trend toward reality? Do they trend toward doing something that's somewhere in between? Like, in your experience, how do you see your students adapting or adopting different kinds of thinking when they're going through this collaborative world building process?
Yeah, I think, what I would say is usually what they do is go with the familiar. And this is also where I work with a lot of game design students who aren't super well read. They're not big readers. They play a lot of games. And of course, a lot of games have very generic stories, right? So they kind of start off there, and they're less interested in things like, oh, well, race, class, like wealth distribute, like those are things that they're not really thinking about if they're trying to make like a world like Gears of War, right? And it's like, okay, but Gears of War is about chainsawing aliens in the face, right? We're trying to write fiction that is going to be meaningful, right? So you need to be able to position people in different places within the society, and once they get it, then it's fine, right? Then it's like, okay, well, now I see how it's going to work, and it starts to roll or whatever. But that's where what I often find is that they will try to flatten things to make it an easy fit, right? So like, and I use the one, religion is one that always comes up, that there's going to be some religion that is super conservative and super strict, and that's what people are going to be. They're the ones that are coming at you, and it's like, okay, but that's fine if that's sort of like the way that they present. But we're going to want to make sure that we have characters that are members of that religion who don't fall into that category, right? That are, maybe they're part of that religion and you resent it, or you don't buy into it, right? And you're going to find much more interesting stories. I always say too, like, so what I do in the world building class is they create their 10 people, places, and things, and then I scramble them all up, and then I deal them back out to them randomly, just using the rand function in an Excel spreadsheet, and say, you got to tell me a story with these two characters, these two, and bring in these two locations, and maybe mentions one of these items. And they will say things like, well, these people would never meet. This guy is rich and this guy is a bum. And I say, well, what if a rich guy, is smoking a cigarette, goes out into the alley to catch a cigarette, right? And there's a bum there, right? That's how they meet, right? Or there's all sorts of ways. So it's really trying to push them to think about the possibility. It's like that sense of like environmental and emergent storytelling. If they've created a world that is coherent and consistent, they should be able to come up with reasons why people from very different walks of life would encounter each other, or someone would find themselves in a bad situation. And I say that's often what the storyteller, that's what we're trying to do. Like I say, there are people who are the stereotypical accountant, who they're really boring and they live at home with their parents and they don't do anything on the weekend. Those people exist. We don't write novels about them. We don't make movies about them, right? Like you need to have things that are going on that are exciting, or whatever. And if we do have movies about them or whatever, it's that their situation is so overwhelming. So it's those moments, those chance moments, those rare things. That's where storytelling, it's not, the mundane. It's the out of the ordinary. It's the not usual thing that makes for the best stories.
It makes me think about sort of one of the things I wanted to come back to anyway, which is the sort of differences or similarities between emergent versus fixed storytelling. And I think one of the things that's very satisfying for me about games or interactive experiences that allow for sort of emergent storytelling is that the constraints of the system are usually the ones that are enjoyable or most engaging, are the ones that have systems that are so well designed that these stories that come out of them feel like they naturally belong in that environment. Yeah. And the flip side of that is if you have a very well-designed world that you're then allowing people to explore. I use Dark Souls as an example all the time, where I think we did a great job leaving enough room for people's imagination, or for that mystery box, or the what I sometimes talk about as the sheep in the box, the thing where you leave room for the imagination of the audience to fill in the gaps. I'm kind of wondering what you think about emergent versus fixed storytelling, and sort of the strengths and weaknesses, or the sort of comparisons and contrasts between those two things. Because I think for me, it is highly situational which kinds of thing work. Minecraft doesn't work for me, but Valheim does. And World of Warcraft is sort of somewhere in between, where the world is highly constructed, but there's a lot of emergent storytelling that happens when you have 40 humans raiding a dungeon together. So like, how do you think about some of those things?
Yeah, and I mean, I tend to think that games are storytelling engines rather than sort of like a story. I mean, I guess they are storytelling. Some games that have very on the rail sort of storylines, they are having storytelling pretensions, but there's so many of them that aren't that great. I think it's because as an author of a video game, in order to tell the story that you want told and to have like the structural components there, you need to take away the agency of the player, right? Like the more you control you want over the story that gets told, you have to take away options for the player and constrain them, right? So I've not played many games that I feel are really on rails that work really, really well. I'm much a bigger fan right now of sort of like the tabletop role playing as well. The games that are just highly environmental and emergent, and I make up my own story. Like Valheim has no narrative whatsoever, but we've been playing for a month now, and we've all got really funny stories about things that happen. And I could easily write a story about some of the things that my character has gone through in Valheim, right? Just through the unexpected things when you find new things or whatever. So it's one of those things that I think. What I was going to say before, too, you'd said something that made me think. I think people who are naturally storytellers and good writers already sort of internalize some of these things about the world being really big and really complex and really diverse, and who has the most interesting stories. And I think it's also, if you consume a lot of media, then if you read a ton, then you're more likely to encounter lots of different types of stories. If you play lots of different types of games, you're more likely to encounter lots of different types of sort of game narratives as well. And I think that's all to the good. I think the problem too is that there's a lot of students who I know, it's probably more film. They want to make a game that tells a story like a film tells a story rather than a novel. And it's like, okay, but each media is independent in terms of what it does well and what it doesn't do well, and there's just so much to learn. I think that's one of the things too, that I don't know how to make a great film. That's not what I do, right? I know how to write good stories, know the mechanics of fiction writing, but I don't really know how you start making a graphic novel or whatever, right? But I think that that's where the gaming impulse, or what the itch that, or the itch that gaming scratches, is just the idea that there's lots of different stories that could be told, right? And same thing, like playing something like Shadow of Mordor. Um, Same thing in that system. If you're not familiar with the Nemesis system, you build up these relationships with these orcs that you're trying to kill. You're trying to whack this one, or you make a deal with that one, and it's all procedurally generated. And it's always changing all the time, and none of it means anything. You know what I mean? It's the story that you bring. It's like, oh man, that's the orc that I tried to kill for the third time. I want to behead him this time. And again, that's 100% player motivated, sort of player constructed story that the mechanics just make available to the players. And I think that's a very worthy thing for game designers to be doing, is just get people in imaginative space. You know what I mean? And they're going to give them some constraints with the rules and the mechanics, and then let them sort of come away with their own stories, and then go on Reddit and tell their friends about things that happen. And I think that's great. Or write fan fiction or whatever it is, right? I think all that stuff is great. I think that's one of the other things too that we kind of circled around, is that just through modes of distribution of media, you used to be gatekeepers, right? You needed, if you wanted to get your story out there, you could hand it out on Times Square if you made a million, photocopies or whatever, but you're not going to have much of an impact. You needed to get it into an editor's hand that was going to publish it and spread it out for you. Whereas now, you got the internet, you got all sorts of ways of being able to get your storytelling out there and share it with people. And it doesn't need to make money, right? It's like you don't need to make money if it's basically a free message board that you're posting to, right? That doesn't cost you anything, and it doesn't cost, I guess you'd probably give up your personal data for that. But it's not like you need to print solid copies of books that then need to be distributed around the world. It costs money, and you need to make a net profit. Your Harry Potter fan fiction doesn't need to do that. So
I don't know if you remember this. Something you were just saying reminded me, but at the last Games Learning and Society conference, I got booed for my bad, well, I think correct, but perceived as bad hot take that The Last of Us as a narrative doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because it deprives the audience, the people playing the game, of the one thing that you play video games for, which is a sense of agency. And it wasn't done in a clever way like BioShock, where that's the reveal, right?
Yeah.
It's about who really controls whom in that situation that made BioShock so effective, but rather it puts you in this, and I won't spoil it, so don't worry about that if you haven't played it, and I'm not going to harp on it for much longer, but one of the biggest, most critical junctures in that game, you are deprived of any agency. And for me as a player, it completely depleted the experience of playing the game of any meaning. That my read of the story was wrong because it was dictated to me in a way that I didn't read the story. And I know for myself, I struggle a lot when you're creating a video game. You have to create constraints because it's virtual, and you don't want players. There's only so much you can do when you're creating a digital interface. But I don't know. How do you feel about things like that, the BioShock versus Last of Us approach to game design or storytelling?
Yeah, Last of Us is another game for me that I'm not a huge fan of. I feel like, and I've had people argue with me about this too, but I still don't agree, that you could just take all the cutscenes, paste them together, and watch that as a movie, right? I mean, like, that's where all the emotional stuff, like me sneaking around, or clubbing a zombie whose head explodes in a spore, like, that's not the story, right? The story is between the man and the girl, or at least that's what the emotional core is. And I mean, I think that's where too, like, I think what I think is sort of fun now too is electronic literature and things like that have always been very game-like. And I think that we are seeing games like 80 Days. I don't know if you're familiar with 80 Days, or like What Remains of Edith Finch is another one, in which you don't have as much control over this. You have sort of minor control over the story, but the writing is really good. And you can kind of assemble stories in different ways. So it's more game-like storytelling than it is an actual game. And I think, one of the things too is that we need better vocabulary to talk about a game. Like, you know, what is Destiny versus what Remains of Edith Finch, right? Like Destiny, we've got first person shooter, you know, whatever. What Remains of, it's like, what is it? It's a story game, you know what I mean? Like we just don't have great ways of talking about it. The other one too that I felt cheated by was Firewatch. I won't spoil that one either. The first half is just sort of like walking around in this highly aestheticized national park, and it's gorgeous. And I feel like they really failed the courage of their convictions, and sort of came up at the halfway point where it gets really sort of like plot focused. I don't know. Have you played it, Steve?
I haven't played it, mostly because I've heard from other people the same thing, where it starts off really, it has a lot of potential and then sort of just squanders it in a way.
Yeah.
So I've kind of avoided it, but I have heard something similar about it.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, I would say the first half is really mundane, and it's just a sort of a quiet story, and then it feels a little bit more like it has to have, you know, like drama or whatever, and it kind of ruins it. And I would have just liked a quiet, you know, a quiet game would have been really, really unique. I felt the same thing like with LA Noire, where you know, you're playing LA Noire and you've got those crime scenes that you're investigating, but then they have all those other like 3 alarm, you know, crimes that you need to go respond to, and it just turns into GTA, right? And it's like, well, if I want to play Grand Theft Auto, I'll just play Grand Theft Auto. You know, you're kind of in it. And again, I think it was one of those things that our gamers going to think it's too boring. And I think, you know, I'm hoping that developers will someday get over that and realize that there's enough audience share for people who want a game like that they can just make that thing, and you know, it'll be a successful, you know, rather than trying to do everything for everyone, it can just do its own little successful thing, and make people happy about it. Because, right, you know, LA Noire is another interesting one that I really like, because it's sort of a fail. I mean, it sort of is a failed game, and it destroyed that company, right? I mean, the company went under for but it's like they were trying to do something interesting, which I really value, as opposed to just pumping out Medal of Honor 14 or whatever, right? You know, and but that also shows the inherent risk. They tried to do something, it didn't quite get it pulled off, and then, you know, it causes their whole studio to go down. So it's cautionary tale.
Well, I mean, that there was also that studio that was owned by like Kurt Schilling, and he that went under, and it had a lot of the game they released. There's Kingdoms of Amalur, that's what it was called, and that was another one that had a lot of potential. They had some good storytellers in there. The first attempt wasn't awesomely executed, but it could have gone somewhere. And you know, trying to there were a lot of problems with that example, but generally speaking, when you're trying to introduce a new technology and you're trying to tell an interesting story and you're trying to do all these other things that appeal to a bigger audience, like, you kind of have to decide, what is the heart of the thing I'm building? What is the heart of the story I'm telling? I mean, and it's not just that a thing has that, but that it allows the player to be a contributor or co-author to that story in a way that doesn't feel contrived. Like,
right.
I completely agree with you about the thing with Last of Us, where, you know, you club with zombie and whatever. Like, it felt like I was doing worksheets or busy work in the middle of all the other interesting things that were happening, and I was never in control of any of the interesting things, right? It was just, I sort of existed as a person who put the input commands just to be able to get to the next step. And that's another place where I find emergent storytelling environments are very satisfying, is not only do I get to learn through exploration and not knowing things, and the exploration is part of the fun, but also, you know, generally speaking, it doesn't feel like anyone's holding my hand to get to a particular end. And in many ways, it reminds me of how Vince Gilligan has talked about how he wrote Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul, where part of the difficulty is that when you have really thoughtful designs or characters, you can't just make them go where you want them to be, right? And this is actually proven out by what happened with Game of Thrones, where they decided what the end point was going to be, and be damned, we're going to get them there no matter what the cost. And
drag them there,
it is sort of that synthesis, that toxic synthesis of sort of, I don't know if it's, I would call it sort of neoliberal thinking about design, you know, how profitable is a thing going to be, that it has to be sold to the maximum number of people, so we got a focus group and the board is going to decide on this, that, and the other thing. So as a result, the thing never really has a core. It just tries to be too many things. And there clearly is an audience for that sort of thing, and in that there are a billion Call of Duty games, and there are a bunch of Gears of War games, and there are people who enjoy playing for those reasons. But I would argue that there would be a much larger untapped audience of gamers who, you know, this sort of thing appeals to. I think that speaks to the nature of indie design being successful in many
Yep.
respects, because they're more agile. They can do
Yep.
these things that other organizations are incapable of doing because their priorities and incentive structures are completely different than.
Yeah.
So,
That's the commercial aspect. I mean, that kind of goes back to me saying your Harry Potter fan fiction can be published for free, right? But making a AAA game costs millions and millions of dollars, right? And it's a high risk affair, so that's why they tend to go with the safest sort of approach. But while you were talking too, I was thinking about the history of Fallout. I haven't played much of Fallout 1 or Fallout 2 because I didn't play them at the time, and now it's kind of hard to go back because they're really slow. You're clicking to get across the screen or whatever. But Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas, I thought were really, really good in terms of the storytelling, the emergent storytelling, the environmental storytelling. And Fallout 4 really wasn't, because the dialogue options, like you just said, there are these things, and it was always like the one silly one, the ones, like sarcastic one or mean one, and it was just, it got very repetitive. And, the thing that was the emergent storytelling with that was the community building, which never really went anywhere or mattered. But that was also like, what part of the wasteland am I going to choose to build up and recruit and defend, and all those kind of things. So it was sort of like a mini game that never really mattered, but it was still, I still enjoyed it. But yeah, it was one of those things that the narrative is just not up to snuff. And I'm going back through now and playing Assassin's Creed Black Flag, and I'm playing Odyssey as well. And those are games in which the core loop, the game mechanics are a lot of fun, and the story is terrible and the writing is terrible, right? So it's one of those things that they're really pretty games, and I don't understand why it's so hard for them to write a story. It's not absolutely ridiculous, because the dialogue is so bad, and it's just it's very repetitive, and the only thing that changes is the scenery. But yeah, those are other ones too, in which it's like I wish they could get somebody on board that could write a halfway decent story.
I think a lot about what the future of games looks like now that we have these new technologies. Like the Quest 2 affords a whole different kind of storytelling. I have new emergent narratives from having played in Death Unchained or any of these other sort of games that are highly dependent on your own experience with them, because there is no overarching narrative. Like in
Right.
Death Unchained, you are just going around with a crossbow or a bow and shooting a bunch of faceless, mobs, zombies, whatever. And I think a lot about, like, will things ultimately become just procedurally generated to the point where all of our experiences are like the holodeck in Star Trek, where essentially you're just having randomly generated stuff around you to simulate a kind of experience? Or will there be a place for these sort of highly scripted, I hesitate to call them interactive experiences, because to me they're not interactive, right? That something like Last of Us is not terribly interactive because ultimately I am not a co-author, and I've written about this in the top context of like levels of narrative, where you have sort of the first level of the authorial intent and what did the author want you to get, and then the second level is sort of that, how did I receive it as the audience member? Did I get the authorial intent or did I not, or does it matter? And then that third level being how we all sort of create community around these spaces, and these communities of practice end up having their own criteria for what is and is not part of this, the core community, the core sense of belonging to this particular medium, whatever it is. So I don't know. I think a lot about what is the future of this going to look like, and I'm kind of curious about what you think as somebody who does this.
Yeah, that's so. I was going to give a talk over in our game design program that sort of got delayed for COVID and things like that. But one of the things I was going to talk about was procedural storytelling. And for the people who are in computer science departments, I learned, much to my shock, that their vision of procedural storytelling is a computer that will tell you a wonderful story that is randomized every single time. And I'm like, well, of course computers can't do that yet, right? We're nowhere near that yet. But what I was saying, procedural generating of stories that we can do right now is that idea that games are story engines, right? Like the game, as long as we've got the world, and this goes back to sort of the world building, if it's consistent and coherent, you should be able to mix up all sorts of stuff, right? And give me a couple random characters or traits, give me a theme, give me some locations, right? And let me find the story. Like that's the part that we like. We like to be the storyteller. And I think there's a lot of space too for storytelling games for people, they may not be great like actual artists or writers or any, like they may not ever be able to create anything that would be commercially viable. But if you get a pizza and some beer and some friends and you can sit around and tell a collaborative story with some structure, I mean, it's sort of like what tabletop role-playing games are, for fun for 4 hours on a Friday night, who's hurt by that? You know what I mean? I think that that's great. So I don't know. I mean, I really wonder about this whole question of whether, we can do the deep fake thing, and you can create, the computer, the AI can create, very, very photorealistic people and generate dialogue or whatever. And maybe the AI will get there to the point at which it makes sense. But I think just even being able, like the chat bots that, you can ask all sorts of questions and hold a conversation, those can only be pushed so far, right? So I think that it's a totally different order of magnitude of difficulty to get a story that makes sense and it's structurally sound. You know what I mean? I just don't even know how you start to control the variables for all of those things, to say that these things would necessarily work and these things won't, because it requires imagination, and computers don't have any imagination, right? They can bash things together, but they're not coming up with the ways that it makes sense, right? So we get all those funny, whenever people say, oh, well, these are the flavors that this, computer, whatever, generated or whatever. And it's like, that'll probably go away. But I really, it's like, they can't even do that. They can't even come up with 12 ice cream flavors that aren't nonsense, right? So like, how the hell are they going to write a 2,000-word story or something like that? I think it's going to be interesting to watch, but I always think too that, the people are more, the player is invested not in being told a story. We have things that tell stories. They're other people, right? I mean, like, we're always going to have sole authored TV shows and movies and all those kind of things, or maybe they're more collaboratively written as well, right? So I don't know why we would want to replace that with computers, but I think that's where, again, the idea that interaction, I think what the computer can do is, have more and more stored in it, right? I mean, this is where too I say the thing with, if you look back at previous versions of Dungeons and Dragons, they've got dozens, if not hundreds, of source books for all of that, right? And that's all story making potential, and you don't have to use all of it. You don't even need to use a fraction of it, right? Like, you just need to use whatever you want, and it is just sort of like a massive D&D database that you could randomly churn out different campaign scenarios or whatever, but then the fun for the player is then go make it into something, right? Like, here are the pieces, you go make it into something. Sort of like, I think it's very much like Valheim and very much like Minecraft, right? They're very simple at a certain extent, and it's all about, the programmers and the designers are not worried about making a story for you. They're presenting a canvas and tools for you to be able to create your own stories. And I think there's a lot more room to run in that area than it is trying to get computers. Because I mean, I do some things too with computational linguistics and natural language processing, and it's just so fun. Like, trying to get computers to read a book and understand what it's about, they are so far away from even getting close. Like, it's really, I'm sure the people that are doing that research wouldn't appreciate me saying that, but they are a long way away from a computer being able to read a novel and understanding what it means. So if it can't even read a novel, how is it going to write one, right?
I immediately was thinking about our games of Fiasco and how that is a lightly structured version of a story, story framework. And so,
Yep.
if we can just create more accessible, more easily applied systems through which, rather than having, I don't know, it depends on the experience you want to have, but rather than necessarily doing all the random dice rolls, like, can we just create a system that allows all of us to take on these roles? And now we're going to role play. My friends and I, when we were younger, had created something that we called Life or Something Like It, and it was basically D&D, but it was just random stuff. And there was a spreadsheet of 100 characteristics that we assigned to people, and we'd roll a D100 a couple of times, and that you basically have to play as that character. And inevitably, they would spiral out of control into something ridiculous happening with some sort of cleaver in a butcher shop outside or part of the supermarket or something. But like, the core of the experience was about basically how can we tell interesting stories with these things, these structures that we know exist in the real world. And for myself, whether it's the example where we came up with the character Jedediah, or if it's the Fiasco where we had the exchange of the Golden Zelda cartridge for parts of a giraffe's anatomy. Like, there are all kinds of interesting stories that have sort of emerged from that framework. And I think you're 100% right that the qualia of being human and understanding the context and why a thing is funny or why a thing is sad or why a thing is important, all of that is sort of baked into how we we talk to one another. It's all about communication, and it's a thing that robots cannot replicate. They cannot replicate the experience of having been in a place and felt it. It reminds me of there's a scene in Good Will Hunting where they're sitting on the bench in the park in Boston, and he tells him how you don't know what the smell of the Sistine Chapel is like. You can't describe that because all you do is read about it in a book. And that's sort of the situation we're faced with AI, is that an artificial intelligence cannot smell the inside of the Sistine Chapel, as far as I know. And I don't think we're anywhere near that happening. So.
Right. Or having an emotional, reaction to something. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, my question is always like, why are we even doing it? But I think the answer is 8-digit NSF grants is the answer. But
well, and I mean, I think that speaks sort of to why I think this is an important series of conversations to have in educational spaces and digital media spaces, because I think it's important that people understand the humanities matter, and that it's not just STEM. Like, STEM matters, but also, and I hate the whole like STEAM thing. Like, I don't want to get off on a whole tangent, but there is a very desperate need, and I think that the social media infrastructure that we have is sort of indicative of what happens when you have this sort of AI-driven libertarian style Wild West of, we're going to let the system work itself out because computers are sufficiently advanced now. And what people don't seem to understand is that computers are not human. They cannot make the same kinds of judgments that humans can, and they often will exasperate or expand the biases of the people who designed them. So obviously the algorithms have biases baked into them that are racially biased or gender biased, or et cetera, et cetera. Josh says, within the vein of computers never overtaking storytelling, I think it's extremely interesting that the emergence of roguelites allows computers to utilize their randomness and stupidity to make games we as players find fun and interesting, even if the games they're randomizing are made out of humanly curated pieces. And I think that it makes me think of Legos. Like, we've kind of achieved the next generation of Legos in some respects, where whether it's me, building a fort in Valheim, or it's a kid in elementary school making a Minecraft story or something like that. I think that's 100% right. Like, I mean, what do you think about the human curated / randomization piece?
Yeah, actually, reading that too, and as you were talking and thinking about roguelites, I was thinking about Darkest Dungeon, which I did a fairly, no pun intended, a deep dive in not that long ago, right? And that's also very narrative light, but you get your characters that you like, and they get certain kinds of afflictions that they need to then go to the bar, go to the church, or whatever, right? And I think that that's exactly right. That's where the power of the computer is being able to have that database, that relational database that would put those things together. But it's always going to be a person who's going to be the one making those relations. Like, I don't see the jump coming in our lifetimes in which computers are able to make that. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm underestimating it, but it seems like we've got a long way to go. It seems like we'll much more likely have Skynet and computers that will eradicate human beings for being, or Agent Smith or whatever, than we will having a computer that writes the next, Shakespearean sonnet or things like that.
Yeah, I actually immediately, after you're talking about Darkest Dungeon, made me think of XCOM, and that the reason XCOM is interesting to me is because I can make the characters people I know, and that gives me emotional investment in their well-being, because I don't want to watch my friends get shot, right? So, and especially if I'll save scum because I'm like that, but if I lost somebody in combat, it makes the game less engaging for me, less fun for me, because I've lost the thing that was driving my engagement in the first place, which is just essentially my emotional relationships or parasocial relationships with characters that are in a video game that's a roguelite or something like that. And I think, to Paige's point about roguelites, the ones that are probably best are the ones that aren't truly random and are more carefully crafted. I don't know if that's specifically referring to something like Spelunky, where it's sort of patternized in a way that it can't, create a truly random world, or if it's more something along the lines of Diablo, where you have sort of the interceding moments of boss fights and whatever, but the path to getting there will always be slightly different, which allows you to have those sort of deviations to talk to your friends about, where, ooh, my version of Diablo was like this, what was yours like? And I think Telltale's games are sort of like that too, although they're obviously not roguelikes, but the idea being that you're just creating a false choice that at least feels like it has some meaning, although that runs into the same problem, right, that Mass Effect ran into, or that any major long-form choose your own adventure runs into, which is eventually it's going to end, and you can't have infinite resources to make infinite endings. So you're inherently sort of pigeonholed. Whereas going back to Valheim, like we can end Valheim on whatever note we want. It could be we had one great boss fight and we all decide we're done, or we finished building the castle that we idealized and Frank Lloyd Wright has come back and whatever. I think there are a lot of different ways that we perceive the stories that emerge from the games we play, and I think the more options there are and the more kinds of it's the reason why I wish the Nemesis system wasn't like copywritten and trademarked by Warner Bros. Because there's so much potential in that application, right? That you can sort of create these characters that are robust in the sense that the database is so deep, you'll never be able to replicate the same thing twice.
Right.
That alone will make these experiences more meaningful. And I imagine there will come a time where you could have a blend of something where the XCOM, I'm going to insert my emotional investment into this game, and the random generation where maybe a team of me and my friends go on a space mission in XCOM, but we're up against these randomized characters, villains or whomever, who have these different characteristics that make the story unique to our experience. So
yeah, exactly. And that's where too, I mean, I think, one of the things that I've talked about with my game design students as well is the way that I keep coming back to the idea of story structure as being like the fractal cauliflower, right? Where you break off a piece and it still looks like the cauliflower. You break off another piece and it still looks like the cauliflower. And there are missions, the best crafted side quests in games like Skyrim and Fallout. It starts with an inciting incident. You run into the NPC, they give you the problem. You can either choose to take it or you don't, right? But that alone, like just saying, okay, well, this person is going to give you a problem, and then you find out halfway through that they're lying, or the vampires are actually good guys, or these people are cannibals, right? You can choose how you want to react to that. So the story is already scripted, right? But then the way that you take that, and then more to the point, you do that 10, 12, 20 times across all these different quests, and you start to develop a way that your character views the world and acts in the world, right? Like, I'm not going to get the wool pulled over my eyes next time because I felt like I got had, right? So I think all of those things, there's no way, the thing that the Fallout says, there's over 300,000 endings or whatever. And basically what they mean is it's 300,000 different movie clips that, what I mean? The order of which could be played through, because it just shows you the clip at the end of how you chose to do those certain missions. But that's where, the thing too, is that the main quest in those games never is the most interesting. It's always some of the side ones. Like I remember too, when I think about stories that were affecting or were effective, you're thinking about Fallout New Vegas, and the one where the guy was the commander was sending out fake radio calls because he was worried that too many people were getting killed, so he was sending them away to safe places so they wouldn't get killed, right? And it's like, well, you can do what you want, you can kill me if you want, or you can turn me in or whatever, right? And it's like, wow, that's actually sort of like, for me, that was a stop in my tracks, kind of like, I don't know what I want to do, I don't know what the right thing to do here is, right? And that's not an easy thing to for a human to come up with a game, with a choice like that that's meaningful and interesting.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, for me, Skyrim's main quest line was very uninteresting and boring, but the Dark Brotherhood was fascinating to me. I loved the Dark Brotherhood quest line, and that's been true of all the sort of Bethesda / other large-scale RPG style games that I've played. And I think one of the things that, as you were talking, I kind of thought about is, as opposed to something like Telltale games where there needs to be that sort of final closure of, this is the big thing we're building up to. The nice thing about something like Skyrim is I get to do those, like you're saying, the 300,000 different endings. I get to decide what order I want to go into and whether or not I want to even bother with some parts of those quest lines. I think that alone, there's this long conversation in the game design community about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, because you ultimately create a bunch of content that maybe no one's ever going to see. And I err on the side of saying I would rather have things that feel unique and special about that experience to the individual interacting with it than something that's going to be like, everybody who plays The Last of Us is going to get the same outcome. Like,
exactly.
And maybe that works. Like, maybe there is a certain population for whom that is a compelling thing. But I think ultimately, if you're somebody who really enjoys stories, often it's about projecting yourself into that story in some way. And actually, one of the things I appreciate about, I think Fallout New Vegas changed this, and certainly Skyrim doesn't have it, but whether or not there's a morality within the game system. you're able to do things that are ethically gray. And that's also the reason why Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones were ever compelling, is because it was interested in the gray areas of existence and not in the black and white. I mean, George R.R. Martin famously said the thing about Tolkien, like, what was Aragorn's tax policy and how did everyone respond to it? Like, and I think, I mean, as cheeky as that kind of comment is, like, the valuable takeaway from it is like, well, you know, if we create these interesting spaces where people have sort of even self-conflicting incentives, like they want to do the right thing, but they're pulled this other direction. Like that's why Jaime Lannister was a really interesting character in the novels, is because you can see his character being torn in these two different directions that is compelling in some way. And so, you know, I think a lot about how all of these things sort of intersect with one another to be good design. And I frequently have said to my students, one of the things that I think gets lost in game design programs or in ed tech programs or whatever kind of specific program you're in is this sort of losing the forest for the trees about why you're doing this thing in the first place. Like, why are you making games if you're not trying to make an impact? Or why are you making this lesson if there's no point or objective that's associated with bettering the world, right? So all of these things are sort of tied into how we think about the stories we tell and how we frame those stories. And you know, I'm grateful for the fact that you have codified them, at least in some way, that we can all rely on to kind of practice these things. And that's kind of maybe my biggest takeaway from having interacted with you over the last 10 years and having worked with teachers over the last 10 years to think about games and play, is that it is not something that people can just get up and do. Like, it does take practice. And I sort of underestimated for myself the amount of prior exposure I had through playing games through my childhood, through my adolescence, through my young adulthood, how much preparation that gave me for doing something like using world building in a classroom or using role playing in a classroom or thinking carefully about how I want to craft narrative for something like a video game. And I think the more that we kind of can create opportunities for folks who are sort of on the periphery of that community to come in and feel comfortable with some of those dynamics, the better off we'll ultimately be. I wanted to give everybody, I mean, we'll kind of wrap up now, but I wanted to give anyone who had any other questions or anything an opportunity to kind of voice them. Feel free to either unmute yourself or to drop them into the chat. But thank you all for kind of coming, at least. And thank you, Dr. Hergenrader, for your valuable time this evening to talk.
Well, thanks for the invite. Yeah, and I think you can pass along my contact info if anyone's got specific questions or things that they wanted to follow up on. I'm happy to, you know, continue the conversation as well. But yeah, I mean, we could talk about this stuff all night, right? I was going to say too, like one of the things that I don't know if other people are tabletop role-playing gamers, I can't think of a single campaign I've ever played that ended with like a crescendo. Like it's just someone, you know, goes on vacation and we just never get back around to it. And that's it. That's just the way that those games tend to end. Or like Minecraft, I was burned out, played Minecraft on my iPad all winter break. And now it's like, I'm just kind of done. You know, like I got this massive world. You've got like 15 maps, you know what I mean? Whatever. And I'm like, I don't want to do it anymore, right? And it's like, I didn't go find the Ender Dragon and kill him, you know what I mean? It's like, that's not the point. I think that's, and I'm fine with that, right? That didn't take away from those experiences. So I think that's, and I think too, what's happening with the younger generations, games are just so much more prevalent and front and center that I think there's going to be more people who are willing to adopt them because they don't see them as like a weird novel thing. They're just a way of understanding and learning the world, right? Or learning something about the world.
That's kind of what I was trying to say earlier about SimCity, right? Like it was just a framework for me to start understanding civic planning, like civic engineering, like civil engineering, like how you organize a power grid. And actually like that becomes deeply relevant because then there are problems like with Texas's winter storm and the power grid goes out. And then there's a conversation about, well, there's this eastern grid and the western grid, but Texas has their own grid. And like I think games are such an interesting on-ramp to be able to talk about all kinds of interesting things. And Mike Young and I have talked extensively about how it's all about figuring out what are the affordances of a given game, what are the affordances of a given story or a story world. How do you use it in service of accomplishing whatever that learning objective is? And I mean, Roger Travis and I and Kevin Balestrini have talked about this in the context of the 1-to-1 ratio, where the game objective has to match the learning objective. And if you can synthesize those things, ensure they are the same thing, that the prompt you're giving is reflective of what it's like to think and act like a certain kind of person, you can get people to practice different kinds of thinking. And that ultimately, I think, is when Plato wrote about storytelling being bad, I think it was because he was worried about the sort of the dangerous side of this, which we've kind of talked about in our own side conversations about things like disinformation, like how narrative can be spun in a way that is emotionally compelling but factually wrong. And,
right.
What is the appropriate sort of counterbalance to that? How do you create information that is both factually accurate and emotionally engaging? These are the kinds of problems we have to solve because there are real problems in the world that demand these kinds of solutions. Like disinformation is not going to go away on its own. There will always be people, blasting the fire hose of falsehood because it serves some purpose. So you have to have this sort of space to critically discern information and understand who's a good faith actor, bad faith actor, et cetera,
yeah.
et cetera.
I would say too, like just for the people who are educators in this group, that having now been in the games and learning community for 10 plus years now, both of us, you can tell the people who get it within 30 seconds of talking to them about it, right? Like they get it, they understand it, they start to talk about what they're doing, and you're like, yep, you got it. And then there are those where it's like it's an iPad with a spelling app where you're a monkey and you have to climb a tree with and it's like, no, you don't get it. Like that's not the good stuff, right? But that's where too, like even just talked about when you mentioned the Games Learning Society conference, GLS conference, the fact that we had that conversation with Kurt Squire, one of the online, one of the people who sort of started and ran it, is that it sort of hit its peak around 2014, 2015 when industry people found out that the best approaches were highly idiosyncratic, done by teachers who are willing to put in the effort. It's not something that you could roll out across an entire district and get a big paycheck for it. And it's like, oh, well, then once the industry sort of like pulled out, then all the money went away. And then it's like, okay, well, there you go. Like no one wants to be told this is like a messy process that requires a lot of, lateral thinking and problem solving on the educator's part. That's not what people, unfortunately, that's good education, but that's not good business. And unfortunately, our education system is in the business of good business. So
I was going to say, I don't even know that it's good education, because I think the corollary in education is standardized testing or No Child Left Behind, and this sort of expectation that you can quantify everything about a student in order to place them in a nice hierarchy of whom is the most meritorious and who is not. And I think it's just such an absurd premise. And I mean, it's the same problem that now higher education is having to deal with, employers have to deal with. It's like, how do we appropriately assess somebody's competency or proficiency? And that's one of the reasons why I harp all the time on the need to sort of rid ourselves of alphanumeric grading completely and focus entirely on what is the process I went through? How much did I gain through a semester? Because it's ridiculous of me to expect everyone coming in the door has an equivalent baseline experience to be able to understand everything that we're doing.
Right.
And the only way that you're going to accommodate everybody is if you understand that you're looking for progress and not looking for a specific outcome. Because if you do that, you'll always be disappointed. Like everyone will always fail your 1,000-person chemistry class because your idea of who a chemist is based on this fictional, non-existent kind of human, right? So, and I mean, I was listening to a podcast earlier today to talk about this. It's like with respect to how you appeal to certain audiences to get them to apply particular kinds of jobs. This is in the context of the government, but the question is, do you end up self-selecting for a certain kind of person because of the assessment structure you've created for yourself? And if you do that, does that inherently inhibit diversity of your thought? And I mean, the answer is yes, but like it's a really complicated, like you're saying, it's complicated, and there's no payoff at the end of this. Like you do it because it's the right thing, and you do it because we know it's the best practice, and you do it because we know this is the best way that people learn, not because I can turn a quick buck. But unfortunately, the educators aren't the one who have all the bucks to give out.
To turn for sure.
So anyway, I think we'll wrap it up there.
Cool.
Thank you again, Dr. Hergenrader, for joining us this evening. Thank you to all of you who sat in and listened to this conversation. Hopefully it was informative in some way or got you thinking a little bit about how you do your own storytelling or how you can use some of these things in your teaching and learning and game design. And certainly if you have any questions, feel free to email me, or I'll put you in contact with Dr. Hergenrader and he can answer them directly for you. So thanks again.
All right.
Round of applause.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.
In the recording.
The sign language. Yep.